Well, that is quite an act to follow. Myself, Chris Wilson, and Dr. Wilson will each make opening remarks of 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll engage in a conversation with each other and with you around these topics. I'm going to go first because I've heard Chris Wilson speak before, and I'm usually too choked up to speak after I've heard him. And hopefully Bill is made of tougher material than I am. I'm speaking to you, and this is very much in the spirit of the wonderful and stirring, challenging remarks we've heard from Dr. Wilson about a book. Stephanie DeLuca, my colleague here at Hopkins, Susan Klempet-Lundquist, another colleague at St. Joseph's University, and I published this spring based on a decade and a half of research in Baltimore. And in fact, it was this book that brought me to Baltimore. I simply couldn't resist it after meeting and following and living through the ups and downs of the lives of the young people that I first met in Baltimore in the early 2000s. The book is called Coming of Age in the Other America, and it's about a cohort of kids who grew up in those very high-rises, or at least were born in those very high-rises that are featured in The Wire. Over time, because of various public policy interventions, the kids moved, often to significantly better neighborhoods. And what we saw was an incredible intergenerational leap forward. If you compare the attainment and the risk behavior of the parents to the children, it was an almost revolutionary leap forward in terms of exposure to crime and violence, school attainment, teen parenthood, and so on. Kids really benefited from having more affluent neighbors, more neighbors who worked, lower rates of violence and crime, and so on. It was such a stirring story. I mean, here were 150 male and female young people from Baltimore, often in families that had been exposed to poverty intergenerationally, and yet a modest improvement. And I mean a modest improvement. They didn't move to the suburbs. They moved to places that were about at Baltimore's average. So neighborhoods we all know about and probably drove through on the way here today. But a modest improvement in neighborhood conditions was associated with much higher rates of high school graduations, much lower rates of involvement with crime, and just a determination to stay on track rather than getting caught up. In fact, I was shocked to learn, and again, you know, we talked to these kids over and over again. We met their parents. We watched them in their classrooms. We talked to their teachers. We oftentimes had contact with their siblings. So we knew them pretty well, and only 27 of those 150 kids spent even a short period of time in criminal activity or in the drug trade. So such a hope, and I'm not known for writing hopeful books, but this was such a hopeful story, and I think we learned something really critical along the way. We were trying to sort of predict, you know, among these kids who really stayed on track and who really did get caught up. And we tried all of the usual explanations, you know, it wasn't really working. But when we look deeper into youth's own narratives, in our research really allows youth to sort of create a narrative. It's somewhat like the Stoop stories you're going to hear about in a minute. They often described something we came to call an identity project, a passion, right? Something that gave them a strong sense of purpose, of meaning and identity. It was like these identity projects were a bridge between where they were at present with all of their struggles and where they wanted to go. So it could be anything from an intense hobby, like Vicky's pigeon keeping, to a more organized activity